Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. As the world reels under the global shock of COVID-19 outbreak, occupied and annexed Jammu and Kashmir is all but forgotten. If Marcus were alive, he would probably have titled it Hit in the Time of Corona. An International Press Institute report published Tuesday says press freedom in IOK is under serious threat from the security forces. According to Ravi Prasad, Director of Advocacy at the Vienna-based IPI, the state is using a mix of harassment, intimidation, surveillance, and online information control to silence critical voices and force journalists to resort to self-censorship. This is not the first report of its kind. Last month, Committee to Protect Journalists painted a grim scenario for journalists working in IOK. Aliya Iftikhar, CPJ's senior Asia researcher, said, and I quote, "In these critical times in Jammu and Kashmir, police must stop harassing and questioning journalists and allow them to do their jobs without fear of reprisal," unquote. To discuss the situation further, we are joined by Gowhar Geelani, who is based in Srinagar, is the author of Kashmir, Rage and Reason. We also have with us Dr. Ather Zia, who is a poet and political anthropologist, associate professor at the University of Colorado, Northern Colorado, and Aliya Iftikhar. I just mentioned her quote in the opening. She is, as I said, a senior Asia researcher at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you to all the three panelists. Let me begin with Ms. Iftikhar. Ms. Iftikhar, as I said, there's now the IPI report. Before that, there was a CPJ report. Freedom House has had its own report earlier, a couple of months ago. The situation seems to be grim. But my question really is, what exactly are all these reports managing in terms of convincing the interested parties, governments, to do something about this?
Thank you so much for having me, Ejaz. I would say that, all of these reports, IPI's, Freedom House, Committee to Protect Journalists, ultimately are arriving at the same conclusion, that the press remains under really severe restrictions and is unable to do its work accurately or safely. And ultimately, what we will continue to call on the Indian government to do and the international community to do is to pressure the Indian government to lift these restrictions and allow journalists to do their jobs safely and without fear of retaliation. Especially, like you mentioned, with the COVID pandemic right now, it is even more telling and even more pressing why this is such a critical time for journalists to be able to report the news accurately, to distribute the information, and for citizens to be able to access that information.
Absolutely. Let me do Gowhar Geelani. But before that, there's something else which has also happened, and this is a new order which will be called the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Adaptation of Central Laws Order 2020. And this essentially is the implementation of 37 central laws in what is now the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Geelani Saab, give me a sense of, CPJ, IPI, Freedom House, Human Rights Watch, Genocide Watch. Everyone is, as Aliya said, reaching the same conclusion. And the situation is very grim. But it seems that the Delhi government is just simply doubling down.
Thank you, Ejaz, for having me. The thing is that even in this, these terrible times of COVID, pandemic, we still are with 2G internet service in Kashmir. And all my colleagues, working for various international and, other dailies and magazines have been, harassed and intimidated by the, security apparatus in one way or the other. All the senior colleagues have been, called for questioning by the group that deals with militancy, insurgency. And they have been, harassed. And the thing is that, for last 8 months, we still don't have any editorials or op-eds, coming from the Kashmir-based press. And the first editorial of any significance came just 2 days back, which, actually demanded restoration of 4G internet services Before that, we have had editorials like, health benefits of apricots, cucumber, how to make salad, and how to do other things, but not on the Kashmir situation. So it's I can name you have read the report, so I don't want to repeat the same thing again, or narrate my own story, how I was stopped and prevented from going to Germany. Everybody knows what is happening to the journalists, but the control on the social media and control on the mainstream media, how to control the Kashmir story and how to contain the Kashmir story continues, and whatever is coming from Kashmir comes at a huge personal risk. And those who are not living in Kashmir have to understand how Kashmiri journalists, reporters who are working for various international organizations have risked their lives and careers, and how they are under strict surveillance from the security apparatus in Kashmir. So the situation indeed is very grim, and you can understand that even in these times they are not restoring 4G services just to contain the Kashmir story.
Absolutely. How to control the story, that is the crux of the matter. But let me go to Dr. Ather Zia. As I said, she's a political anthropologist, but she's also the author of Resisting Disappearance, Women's Activism and Military Occupation in Kashmir. Dr. Zia, you obviously worked on this much before what happened last year on 5th August. So this is not new, except that this is a step further towards the kind of exclusionary regression that we have seen with this BJP RSS government. Give us a sense of what your findings were when you were writing this book.
Well, what we saw happening on August 5th is just in the long continuum of what has been happening with Kashmir under Indian rule since 1947. So what we actually see is culmination of what India has wanted so long, which is a forcible annexation, forcible integration of Kashmir into India. And that's what we saw, and that's what we're seeing even in the repression of journalists. Kashmiri journalists have been very stringently and very genuinely following the ground and reporting what's happening on the ground. And the reason that they are being repressed so badly, and I would use the word humiliated, that's what is being done, because the way they're being repressed, as if they cannot actually genuinely report what's happening on the ground. And that's what the world needs to hear. And that's the narrative, as Gowhar said, that is being controlled by India. And the narrative is that people want something, and that is a right to self-determination, and thinking about the third option of independence as well. So that is part of the finding of the book, trying to kind of revise and look back at the history which Indian narrative has controlled for so long. And now we see people talking about critical Kashmir studies. We see people talking about genuinely what's happening on the ground. And even though the journalists are at the moment repressed, but there is a slight consensus that is emerging from the world as we see in the reports that something really wrong is happening in Kashmir. So I think at this moment, what we need to do is we need to amplify the voices of Kashmiri journalists, amplify their situation, and also amplify what's happening on the ground in light of the pandemic, because there is not enough information. Just yesterday, there's people coming together and talking about that Kashmiris are not even able to access genuine medical information. Journalists are not able to, give that information to people. So it's all a culmination of what India has wanted so long, which is to repress Kashmiris and which is to repress genuine information coming from the ground.
Dr. Zia, one of the points I have personally been making since August the 5th is that, there's a general sense that the Congress government was a more secular, inclusive government, and we now have this BJP RSS government, which is obviously, we know, is extremely regressive. There's so much evidence of that. But frankly, for instance, the manner in which 370 was hollowed out, AFSPA and PSA and the rest of it, all of this was happening under the so-called secular inclusive governments. So perhaps there is need to highlight this point that what we see today, as you very rightly said, has been a continuum, that this is a trajectory where Modi is as much to blame for what he did, but neither can Congress be, you can't say that Congress was any better than the BJP RSS government.
Well, in case of Kashmir, what we've seen is that all Indians they have a consensus across board. One of the only impediments that some of the what quote unquote liberals in India had with what has happened on August 5th is that they saw that this was not done in the right manner. Not that the fact that this is completely illegal and unconstitutional according to their own constitution, but they saw that this was not done in the right manner because there was no government, people were not asked. But that's not what Kashmiris know. What Kashmiris know is that from 1947 onwards and 1949 onwards, when Article 370 was adopted, it's completely been eroded. And very recently, a Congress politician also said that we have hollowed out 370 12 times before this, but no one uttered a word because it was done discreetly. Not that direct and indirect violence hasn't been used on Kashmir and Kashmiris in the last 72 years. But what we saw BJP do is because they have control of both houses, control of their masses at the moment, and we see fascism really, really on the rise and Hindu supremacy kind of, just ruling the roost. They just went in and militarily, the spectacle was very, very militaristic, putting the valley under the lockdown, 48,000 extra troops, and what they did to the people, and which is also going on, and which is also the pivot of your program, thinking about the journalistic repression, which should not be there in any democracy, so to speak. So Congress, BJP, everyone is the same for Kashmir because all of them have a consensus on what they want to do, which is it's called occupational constitutionalism in many scholarly works, what has been done to Kashmir for the last 72 years.
Absolutely. As far as following out of 370 is concerned, I think one of the definitive works on that was penned by A.G. Noorani. It details how that happened. But let me go back to Aliya Iftikhar. Aliya, give me a sense of, since information is power, and we just talked about the fact that this is a story that Delhi wants to control. What is your sense of, as a observer and researcher, what's your sense of how the Indian mainstream media have dealt with the Kashmir story?
Well, I think that unfortunately, what we have seen since August, while it has been more extreme in the restrictions, like Dr. Zia has pointed out, these are not anything that's new. These tactics are not new. The methods of repression, the attempt to control the narrative is not new. So I think what we've seen from Indian media, mainstream media also, has been for the most part, they have towed the line. There's been an unwillingness to be critical, to offer critical commentary, and to really observe the facts on the ground and to talk to the people. This is not to say that all Indian mainstream media is doing this. There are, of course, outlets that have correspondents on the ground that are doing the ground reporting. But I think that, unfortunately, for the general public, the Indian mainstream media has been the only source of news to get information from Kashmir. And that's not how it should be. The Kashmiri journalists and Kashmiri news outlets should have the freedom and the space to be able to report what's happening on the ground and around them.
Absolutely. Gowhar, give me a sense of, of course, there's this, with all this repression, surveillance, controlling the narrative, and especially given the powers of the center as far as Kashmir is concerned, it's very clear the level of repression. But how are you getting the information given the lockdown, given various other snags in trying to get the information, to collate the information, to analyze the information, and then, of course, having to also put up with state repression?
I think it's a very good question, Ejaz. Just to give an example, that all our leading opinion makers who had been writing in local newspapers have not written any opinion piece for the last, 8 months now, barring a couple of pieces, one from the, unionist politician, and there was a response to it by a Kashmiri opinion maker. So that has been, how opinions have been suppressed. But as far as the news gathering is concerned, the entire process of news gathering has suffered because the politicians, bureaucrats wouldn't speak to you as they would earlier. There is a degree of they hide information, and then the only option for you is to do more legwork and go to people and risk your life in a situation where you did not have internet in the first place. Forget about 2G or 4G, you didn't have internet at all. And then you could not also use your mobile or other devices to file the story. So you had to go to this one building where they had kept some computers at a facility provided by the government, a Department of Information, where every journalist, over 250 journalists, knew that whatever they would write and whatever they would send across would be under surveillance, because it was people were using Wi-Fi's from 8 computers. So, more than 250 accredited and non-accredited journalists and photojournalists had to depend on that small facility. And it was, it was like, as Ather used the right word, it was humiliation. It was not a facilitation center, it was a humiliation center. And that is how, they tried to not only contain the story, but also, they wanted to instill a sense of permanent psychological defeat among the, Kashmiri journalists as well as the common people, that you are defeated now. And now there is a new narrative that you have to toe this line or otherwise face consequences. So I don't want to name the individuals. Almost all my friends, colleagues have been summoned by the local police and the counterinsurgency grid, on a routine basis, and they have been questioned for hours.
It's very.
Their phones have
Let me interject. Let me interject here. Gowhar. I mean, why would counterinsurgency force deal with journalists? Counterinsurgency is about a force that counters an insurgent movement, which is supposed to be an armed, movement. Journalists are just simply doing their job, which shows that, symbolically and otherwise, it seems to me that anyone writing critically is supposed to be an insurgent in the eyes of the Delhi government.
Not only that, Ejaz, it's not about doing a very critical story. I would give you one more example. A person who works for the Hindu newspaper, he just filed a story on detentions. And it was a rotation, how people were being arrested, how there were mass arrests. And then he was called by the, SSP Srinagar, and he had to present himself before the police station. There were several harassment calls made to his house. All details of his family members were noted down. And then he was, even if there was a simple story, which otherwise journalists all across the world do, normal ground reporting. But one of the counterinsurgent officers, called 3 prominent journalists in Kashmir. And to one of them, he said that, I would use the Urdu expression, exactly the words he had used was, "Main militant ko yahan pe thokta hu," pointing towards the chest. So that is how grim the situation has been. But despite that, journalists have, summoned a lot of courage to write stories. But generally, the Kashmir newspaper, the Kashmir-based media, I would say the local media has been finished. I mean, it has now become a propaganda tool for the government, especially for the BJP government. You will see a lot of advertisements, of front page advertisements, and only the information from the BJP's point of view. So, one of another colleague of mine who just reported on Yasin Malik's statement, and he was also summoned. And I can give you countless examples, but even at present times when there is COVID pandemic, the first case that was tested positive in Kashmir again happens to be the mother-in-law of a very senior SSP officer who got her without screening from the Srinagar airport because of this VIP culture. And the point that you were trying to alluding to, it is in effect a police state where
Absolutely.
this influential police officer got his mother-in-law exited from the gate without any scrutiny, and then she tested positive, and this was the first positive case in Kashmir.
Absolutely. Dr. Zia, it's really interesting. A counterinsurgency force officer calls in journalists and then says, I shoot the militants in the chest. Now, language is very important, just like information. The use of certain terms. Is this insurgency? Why are the journalists being tagged as militants? Do you think that this is also part of controlling and propagating a certain narrative?
Well, journalists have a long precedence, or journalism in Kashmir has a long precedence of being repressed. And also the fact that this is not a section of population that has been let on easy. For the longest time now, Kashmiri journalists have been working under repressive conditions. It's not only after August 5th, and Gowhar will bear me out, that it's been like this ever since, that journalists have been every decade repressed in different ways because the government wants to get out a certain narrative, and the Kashmiri journalists will not just fall in line. And even today, as we're speaking, and with all these reports, and with the curbs on information and curbs on the communication, there are two journalists very emblematic of what has happened to Kashmiri narrative, especially through journalism. There is Asif Sultan, who did a story on Burhan Wani, and ever since he has been in custody. And the other journalist is Qazi Shibli, who technically was disappeared till very recently, till his parents and family came to know where he is. So again, he's just heading this small portal, and he is also under arrest. And these are young journalists who just did a story. And this is part of, when we think about the implementation of Armed Forces Special Powers Act, although that's just a facade for propagating this military occupation in a different way, the control is under the army, and every Kashmiri is a suspect. And from journalists to any civilian walking down the road, everyone is a suspect. Everyone is a suspect. And Kashmir is actually, it's emblematic of the death of what, democracy means for India.
Absolutely. Before I wrap up the segment, let me go back to Aliya. Aliya, the work that you do, and of course, organizations like CPJ and IPI and, Freedom House, they're equal opportunity offenders. So states don't particularly like such organizations. But do you also, based on your reports, lobby with the governments, with legislators across the world, especially in the so-called developed democracies?
Absolutely. So a big part of what our work is, in addition to doing the research and reporting, is, like you said, advocating on numerous levels. So we'll advocate at state levels, with the Indian government, at the UN, at the European Union, with the US government. So we've been doing a lot of efforts in trying to get the restrictions in Kashmir to lift. And unfortunately, we've had some gains. We've seen the social media ban lifted. We've seen certain internet services being restored, but it's still not enough. And I think what we are going to continue to say and, pressure the international community is that what India is doing in Kashmir right now continues to be extremely undemocratic, extremely repressive, extremely authoritarian, and the international community should not be treating India as, the world's largest democracy when it's not upholding those values.
Unfortunately, because of COVID-19 outbreak, the Delhi government has got enough time to further repress Kashmir and the Kashmiris, because the story's thrust has shifted from that repression to, as I said, the global shock here. But thank you so much to all my panelists, Gowhar Geelani, Dr. Ather Zia, Aliya, Iftikhar, for your insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's threat to the staff of International Criminal Court. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. In a statement which has been widely criticized, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo named two individuals in the office of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and threatened possible sanctions against them. Pompeo's remarks, delivered from the State Department podium, came in the wake of prosecutors' investigation of the Afghanistan situation, an investigation approved by the appeals chamber of the court on 5th March. What prompted Pompeo to say what he said, and whether what he said has any legal basis? For that, we are joined this evening by Jeffrey A. Stacey. He is a national security consultant, a former State Department official in the Obama administration, and also the author of the book, Integrating Europe. We also have with us Mr. Ahmad Murid Partaw, the former Afghanistan senior national representative to the US CENTCOM and a graduate of political science from the University of South Florida, is currently teaching as an adjunct professor of political science at Hillsborough College in Tampa. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Stacey. Mr. Stacey, there are a number of officials, it's actually a signed letter, that have said that essentially Secretary Pompeo is way out of line when he said what he did. Do you agree?
I think it's hard not to agree from just about any perspective, depending on where you sit in the world. There is a lot of legitimacy to the International Criminal Court, and that means in this capital as well as yours and numerous others. We have, unfortunately, an administration, in particular leadership, that is averse to, well, let's put it bluntly, law, international law. And that is a worrisome factor in multiple respects, but in particular, the area in and around the theater of Afghanistan, its borders and surrounding states. This does not bode well for the peace negotiations, for even a ceasefire ahead of that. It is highly in the interests of this administration, as well as the other players in this peace process, to allow this investigation to go forward. After all, the most important signatories to the recent agreement, the initial agreement, is another entity that has engaged in alleged acts that this administration should want to see investigated as much as anything related to potential war crimes for American personnel.
When this happened, 5th March, I did a program, and at least one of the panelists made 2 points. One was, of course, that the US does not accept the ICC jurisdiction, and the other was that the Obama administration, the Bush administration, people should thank the Trump administration, because whatever happened then was under these administrations. Now, I thought that was an interesting point, although that panelist was rebutted by another one who gave obviously various other reasons for why that should not be the case, and you just gave one reason yourself. So how would, assuming this had happened during the Obama administration, when you were also part of that administration, how would the Obama administration have reacted to this?
Well, it certainly would not have threatened the prosecutors with any sort of sanctioning or anything along those lines. That we know with certitude. There would have been a sort of, not a de jure, but more de facto cooperation with the ICC, and a willingness to at least see the process move forward and, if you will, informally cooperate with it. There is, I'm sorry to say, even in the Obama administration, some concern about where a prosecution itself might eventually lead, but at least in terms of the official business of the prosecutors and their staffs and the proceedings that they would undertake, there would be tacit support for that, if not even more.
Absolutely. Now, interesting, I mean, I'm just quoting from this letter that I mentioned earlier. It says this act of, Pompeo's threat this act of raw intimidation of the prosecutor's staff members is reckless and shocking in its display of fear rather than strength. Mr. Partaw, what are your initial thoughts with reference to Secretary Pompeo's threat?
I think I do concur with Mr. Stacey's remarks that the administration, the Trump administration in this case, should pursue the torturers instead of the investigators, because there obviously has been crimes committed during the last 2 decades in Afghanistan, and those crimes need justice. And we see that the Afghan conflict cannot be resolved without a transnational justice that's needed in every war. And we have seen this in the cases of Africa and some other places. Coming after ICC, I think is from this administrations, as they have announced, is the new normal in international relations, if you will. And the administration, the US administration, does need to allow the ICC to pursue its investigations on those who have been allegedly against crimes against humanity in Afghanistan and some other places.
Mr. Partaw, one of the arguments that's being given is that, as you know, since being an Afghan yourself and long-time observer of what's happened in your country, which is extremely tragic and unfortunate, that there are a number of sort of players here. Of course, the US forces, then the Afghan forces, then the Taliban, the Islamic State. If you recall, during President Karzai's tenure, there was an effort to look at rights abuses and war crimes, and there was a report that was compiled by a commission, but it never saw the light of day. So, those who argue against this say, well, you got to move on, because this is not going to come to anything. They're being pragmatic in the sense that no one wants this truth to come out.
I think this is very important, particularly during the peace talks with the Taliban. As I mentioned, we do need transitional justice, and ICC is a very good platform, a legitimate and credible platform to pursue those who have been allegedly of war crimes in Afghanistan and crimes against humanity in these 2 decades. I think the ICC and other international, Amnesty in this case, or other international institutions, criminal institutions, should pursue on Afghanistan case because they are legitimate. They have a legitimacy that can even help the peace process. As I mentioned, the Afghans want transitional justice for the crimes.
Some kind of truth reconciliation framework. Thank you so much. That was Ahmad, Murid, Partaw speaking with us. Mr. Stacey, the point really is that while one set of actors would want the focus of this kind of investigation on another set of actors, they would want that they should not be involved in that. I mean, so it should be about the Taliban. The Taliban would much rather want the investigation to target the US NATO troops and the Afghan troops. And at the end of the day, this is like a covenant in which no one really wants any kind of investigation.
Well, that is true. I mean, because there are, unfortunately, civilian targeting on all sides, intentional or unintentional, to large degrees or small degrees. In fact, we've seen just in the last couple of days some civilians killed from, if you will, Taliban fighters in particular. I mean, right up to the Secretary of State's comments. So we have a situation essentially where letting the legitimate process play out is, as my colleague also alluded to, in the interests of all parties. That includes those who have either formally or informally supported the Taliban, formally or informally supported the government of Afghanistan. So we have a situation essentially where the number one objective is the peace process and nothing else at this point. And that includes intervening states in the country. That includes different parties and different politicians and even different regional leaders in the country. We are essentially, with the peace negotiations in the balance, and if I may be frank, the U.S. has not performed adequately most recently with regard to the expectation from all parties, including on Capitol Hill, Republicans and Democrats, both, that there would not be premature departure of U.S. troops. And that is where things are now, because the expectation was that, and including from the Taliban themselves, was that they would move from the successful one-week ceasefire into direct intra-Afghan talks, and that those would lead to a measurable outcome, maybe, as we saw with the Iran JCPOA, an interim agreement, but at least a ceasefire to begin with. The Taliban themselves committed to that, so have the stakeholders. That is the goal, that is the prize. It's now in everyone's interest, and with coronavirus getting in the way now of security operations, let's all use this as an opportunity to take a pause, including with this court process, and move all of it forward.
I largely agree with you. Let me go back to Secretary Pompeo's threat. So one of the things that people are generally talking about is that, well, of course, the U.S. doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the ICC, but as you yourself said, that in the Obama administration, you would have tackled this issue in a different way. The kind of language that is generally used by officials of the Trump administration is like something, it's like you're in a hood and you're doing something which is completely crude and brazen. It's a projection of power on the street. And that doesn't really bode well for multilateralism or for a rules-based process or framework or global security architecture.
I mean, touche, you could not be more correct. And this is not essentially the Soviet Union speak. This is supposedly the leader of the free world. Now, if you are going to have any legitimacy whatsoever, which this administration does not seem to have a great deal of at present, then you've got to look at the wider interests here, and especially down the road. The United States, no matter what party's in power, and this goes for just about every country in the global community, essentially needs this court to be successful. And that means that you go along to get along at times like this, and the last thing you do is go after people by name and threaten them with international sanctions and some sort of process that could actually lead to, of all things, somebody being on an Interpol search list or something like that. It's a bit ridiculous. It's time that the rhetoric is essentially brought to a standstill, and that quietly this administration allows the ICC investigators to proceed. If President Trump wants a peace prize, I mean, you've got to see the bigger picture here. All sides do.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Jeffrey A. Stacey speaking with us. We are now joined by Kevin Heller, who is Associate Professor of International Law at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Heller, we were talking about the threat that Secretary Pompeo issued to two staffers of the prosecutor's office at the ICC, and he did this from the State Department podium. How do you respond to that?
with shock and horror. And he didn't just threaten the two ICC employees by name. He also implicitly threatened their families as well, saying that they would look into whether the families of these two men are planning on traveling to the United States at any time soon, or engaging in some other kind of activity, I guess, threatening to the United States. It really is a categorically different level of threats than we've seen in the past.
And, this is, okay, so I was looking at a letter that has been issued by and signed by almost 7 or 8 former US officials, including special, prosecutors against war crimes. And it says the International Criminal Court has an independent and impartial mandate. Secretary Pompeo's crude threats against these two staffers debase America's commitment to the rule of law. Now, the point is that while we know that the US does not accept the jurisdiction of the ICC, the kind of threat that was issued by Secretary Pompeo is more akin to some kind of gangland leader, threatening someone in the hood rather than diplomacy.
I completely agree with you. As you said, the United States has never been an enthusiastic supporter of the court. One of the few bipartisan issues in the U.S. is not joining the court. On that, the Democrats and the Republicans have always been in agreement. But the U.S. has also in the past been willing to use the court when the interests align. They
Absolutely.
Worked with the court in Uganda with the Lord's Resistance Army. They worked with the court in Congo when Ntaganda turned himself in Rwanda. They've worked with the court in Darfur, with their mutual interests on preventing genocide in Darfur. So this is really something quantitatively different. The idea that the Secretary of State would stand up on a podium and make personal threats to ICC employees is really shocking. And to be honest, it goes beyond even anything that other states that don't like the ICC have done. Certainly Russia hasn't threatened the court in this way. The Kenyan government never threatened the court in this way. The Sudanese government has never threatened the court in this way. So this is really something new and really something disturbing.
Professor Heller, what's the legality of what Secretary Pompeo?
I mean, there's nothing illegal about it. It's certainly ill-advised. It's certainly counterproductive. It's certainly shocking. He's not violating any laws. The U.S. isn't obligated in any way to cooperate with the court. But one does have to ask whether this is an intelligent rhetoric for the U.S. to be adopting at a time of such global crisis.
Okay, so here's the thing about legal frameworks. I mean, there are laws and then there's a normative framework, the norms. Would you say that the way in which Secretary Pompeo formulated what he said was normatively unbecoming?
It's shocking. I mean, he's supposed to be the head diplomat of the most powerful country in the world, and to engage in, as you kind of said, gangster-like tactics to threaten an international organization. It's horrible. I mean, nobody expects the U.S. to enthusiastically embrace the court. We understand that governments don't like when their own officials and their own military their soldiers and their intelligence agents, nobody likes that as a government. But we still expect better from a country that likes to see itself as the shining city on the hill, a leader in democracy and human rights. All of these kinds of actions are so inconsistent with the image that the U.S. has traditionally wanted to, kind of demonstrate to the world.
Professor Heller, if truth told, the United States, whenever it suits the U.S., would go along with certain multilateral arrangements. When it doesn't suit the U.S., it won't. But what we saw previously was that even when there's a bit of arm twisting or some kind of, exercise of power, it's done in either a more sophisticated manner or done covertly or done in and through complex negotiations and, sort of drawing on IOUs and various other methods. But this seems to be the first time that a Secretary of State has used the State Department podium to issue a threat.
As the old saying goes, the fish rots from the head. And Donald Trump has shown again and again his complete contempt for international law, for the rule of law, for multilateralism. Pompeo is really just carrying out the policies of his master. And they seem to have made a very conscious decision that being belligerent and being a bully is the best way to accomplish U.S.'s foreign policy ends. And I think I disagree with that. I imagine you disagree with that. I imagine most viewers would disagree with that. But that is the policy that they're pursuing. And this is just another example of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Professor Haider speaking with us. This is all for this week. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night. Goodbye.